Welcome to the Cult is King podcast. I'm your host, Rambling Bones, joined by my co-host, the Duke.
Hello.
And Duke, what is it that we do here?
So we watch the movies you haven't seen. Those films that, whether they were just classics that didn't catch on, or in some cases forgotten classics, or some movies that are just terrible, but you should watch them anyway.
This time around, I picked something very different.
Yeah, Bones really likes it when we punch above our weight class here.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I would describe this movie as being, punching above our weight class.
Just a reminder that our last movie was about Richard Keel eating shaving cream.
Yeah. So, I picked Stalker, directed by Andrei Tarkovsky, and written by Arkady and Boris Strugatsky, who wrote the book that it's based off of, Roadside Picnic.
And if I'm not mistaken, Bones, you just recently finished the book.
Yes, I didn't really need to listen to the entire audiobook before we did this podcast, but I've been sort of looking for an excuse to listen to the book. There's a video game series also based off the book, so I won't stay too long on comparing and contrasting the three different versions of this story, but I will devote a little time of the podcast to talk about that.
I was just impressed you could read until you told me it was an audiobook.
Yeah, I don't have time to read.
Or the ability.
Or the ability.
Cult movies is about feeling good. It's not about reading, man.
Exactly. Now, the synopsis is actually pretty easy to give for this movie. The little bit of backstory is in Russia, or I'm assuming this movie takes place in Russia. Everyone's speaking Russian, so you just sort of assume that that's where it's supposed to take place. There is what is called the Zone. Now, in the movie, it opens up with a little bit of a scientific blurb that they don't know whether it was a meteorite or aliens or what have you, but this area that has been quarantined off is really weird. It's full of strange things and death traps. And you have what are called stalkers, who they're essentially guides. They take people into the zone. Our main characters, Stalker, Writer, and Professor. Nobody gets an actual name. Stalker is leading Professor and Writer into the zone to find what is called the Room. There is, in the zone, this room where if you go into it, you can have a wish granted. Probably, like your deepest desire kind of wish. And that's it. That's the movie. They go to the zone, and then they philosophize for 2 hours and 44 minutes. Duke, this movie, tell me if this sort of jives with what you're thinking, but this movie really does the tell, don't show approach to...
In some ways, though, it's less that they're constantly describing how things work, but more about what it might mean.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is a lot of the world building, if you will, the way the zone works or what it might mean or what its significance must be, they constantly are kind of like hinting at it or giving you kind of the ideas in dialogue as to what might be going on or what its significance might be. And in that sense, it's not really tell, don't show, because really it's a very good movie, but it's a very frustrating movie. They're not really willing to spell a lot out for you. And if you came in from the idea of oh yeah, this was that video game, you have no idea what you're in for.
Yeah, even if you came in having read the book, I think for some people they will not like this movie because not a lot happens. It is they go into the zone and they walk around. The Stalker throws a nut with a bandage wrapped around it. He throws it, they walk to it. He throws another, they walk to it. And they do that for a really long time. And then, again, they philosophize. This movie is nothing but I would describe as like debating or talking about their beliefs.
Right. Now, granted, it's done in a way I think that's interesting, and it's not like just pretentious drivel.
Yeah, that's the weird thing is, for one, I say it's tell don't show, but the movie is absolutely beautiful. Every shot is perfect. The style, it's phenomenal. Really beautiful movie. One of the best shot films I've ever seen. But again, it's all like character interaction. So
Right.
you really get a feel for all the characters. The characters have a lot of depth to them, but again, it's there's not a lot of external conflict.
Right. And there are some tense scenes, and there's a lot of times danger is being hinted at, but rarely is there anything in the open for us to look at.
Yeah, I think that would be one of my sort of complaints, especially having come from both the book and the game, is that the zone itself is sort of a character in this movie. But we only maybe get a couple scenes where the zone really does anything.
Right, because, okay, so part of what's significant about being a stalker is the zone constantly changes, we're told. And it lets in people, supposedly, they theorize that it lets in people who are hopeless. And the stalker's job is to basically know the zone as well as they can to kind of know the rules that govern it and to take people in and out, everybody seeking the room. And we're told that there's lots of death traps, and we're told that it can change in an instant. But these aren't necessarily things we see. For instance, our stalker, as Bones mentioned, is constantly like has these bandages and these nuts, and he throws them to make sure it's safe to go, and then he goes on. And I'm gonna give you some spoilers here, but at no point does his doing this ever yield anything dangerous.
Yeah.
We see him do it, so we assume that there is danger everywhere, but we never actually see a trap get triggered or anybody get killed from it. We do know the zone is dangerous because one, the Soviets have it completely blocked off. They won't follow but anybody into it. We see evidence of guns and tanks and stuff that have been destroyed, but of no point during the events happening in the film do we see anything.
Yeah, there's an occasional skeleton in the movie, and then there's this one shot where there's a field full of derelict tanks and artillery and a machine gun nest where there's skeletons in there. So you know that it's dangerous from stuff like that. And there are the couple scenes where the zone really expresses itself are one point the stalker makes is sometimes the best path to something is not a straight one. Now, Ryder, he doesn't listen to the stalker very well, or at least he tries to. They both don't listen to the stalker as well as they should. And the room is actually early on, the building that it's in is right in front of them.
Right, no, they start the journey with the room literally within sight, yet they're so far from it.
And Ryder, the stalker, tells him, "No, we aren't going directly towards it. We're going a long way." And Ryder says, "Screw you," and proceeds to walk towards the room. Now, this is the first instance of something weird happening because a disembodied voice tells him to turn back when he almost gets all the way there. And so he walks back. And I think they do this all in one shot, but they show the building, then they don't show the building, and then when they show the building again, it's completely covered in fog. But there's the disembodied voice. Then later, Professor gets separated from both Ryder and Stalker, and this weird. Even watching it, I felt confused because it's just shot funny, but it's supposed to be. Where, despite having gone back, the professor ended up ahead of them because the zone sort of warped things and brought them all back together. Then I think maybe, unless you can think of one, the last thing that really stood out to me is there's this one part where they're in this room full of sand mounds, and
Right.
this bird flies in, disappears, and then the bird flies in again, but then lands.
Right. No, that whole scene is kind of trippy there.
Yeah.
But other than that, we don't really see the zone do anything terribly supernatural. And that's part of why I say it's a frustrating movie, because you go on with these expectations of it and it doesn't do what would be obvious.
Hmm.
Because I think if anybody else would have known, like at some point, okay, well the zone has to
He
attack
he
or
should
do
throw
something.
a nut and it should explode in midair, and we should know, okay, the zone means business.
Right.
You don't have to kill any of the characters, but doing something like that would
But everything
add.
we know about the zone, we kind of learn in a very passive way, either through him talking about it, or, like I said, we see signs that there were things destroyed in the zone, but we never see any destruction from the zone.
Yeah.
Um, and to further complicate and make things frustrated, when they actually get to the room, after all of this, neither the professor or the writer decide they actually want to go in.
Yeah, well, the professor, he brought a bomb with him and he was going to destroy the room, but he doesn't even end up doing that. He decides against it, but none of them go into the room, and then they all come back home at the end. So they leave the zone.
Well, and that's another interesting thing to me, though, about the room, is despite the fact that we have like a professor and we have the writer, and both of these are incredibly like cynical characters. At no point in the movie is it anybody ever doubt that the room is real or that it can do what they say it is. It's taken for granted in the movie that that's just a given.
I think they sort of, I mean, they do believe that it's real, but then they're like, well, maybe it's not real. But at the same time, I think they all think it's real.
Right. Well, I mean, obviously the professor does because he's
He
so
brought a
worried about
bomb.
right, he's so worried about it being misused by somebody that he wants to blow it up. And part of the reason I think the writer is afraid is I think the writer thinks that it's not necessarily a conscious wish you make, but it's what you really desire. And he's more than aware that what we really desire might very well destroy us,
Yeah,
especially if you're a louse like the writer is.
sort of touching on the philosophy. We can't go. We only A saw this once, and B, this is a movie you need to see multiple times maybe to fully understand. But just sort of touching on the themes and things I noticed is there's a sort of thread where the stalker is like trying to bring happiness to unhappy people by taking them to the room to get happiness from the room. And with the writer, you get the sense that he writes because he's unhappy, and if he was happy he wouldn't write, and there it would like defeat his purpose in life.
Yeah, no, it's like the only thing that drives him to do his purpose is being miserable.
He is surprisingly almost more materialistic and cynical than maybe even the professor is in his philosophy, because when you're first introduced to him, he's talking to some girl and he's like, yeah, everything is just, A equals B equals C. And if you go to the zone, it'll be the same thing, just with slightly, different rules to find out. He's just very,
Yeah, no, I mean, he even tells her at some point that, in the medieval times, every, village had its goblin, every church had its god, and now there's just like, nothing because we know that it's all actually really boring.
yeah. The movie, and this could just be my own interpretation or my own thoughts being imprinted on it, but it feels really Dostoevsky in what it's talking about.
Right, and that's kind of makes me surprised it got made in some ways. So, this was made in Russia in the time of the Soviet Union, and if you're not familiar with kind of the policies of the Soviet Union, like most communist regimes, they tend to have a very materialistic philosophy. They had kind of a state religion of atheism.
Yeah, and I mean, this was the 70s, so they had turned down a lot of the persecution that they had been doing towards the Christians at the time, but it was still, a little, Christianity was discouraged for the most part. For like,
Or really any kind of spiritual
yeah,
practice.
honestly, any religion was discouraged. But for example, Tarkovsky directed a movie called Andrei Rublev about a Orthodox icon painter, And that movie was banned for 2 years after it was made.
Well, eventually, Tarkovsky would leave Russia, and I think part of that had to do with his last movie. He was constantly wrestling with the censors,
Hmm.
and it's not hard to see why. I mean, though this movie doesn't necessarily come out, slap you in the face, and say, "Hi, I'm a Christian movie," it definitely has spiritual themes of some sort. At several points in the movie, or maybe at least one, I thought it was more than once, the Bible is even quoted.
Beyond that, the book itself was another thing that dealt with censors, and pretty much everything had to go through a board. And unlike in America, where it goes through the ratings board and they tell you, here's the rating, you should cut out all of these things and we'll drop the rating down. This was much stricter when it came to
You can,
what must be removed.
yeah, you can drop all of this, or the movie cannot be shown,
Yeah. And it's kind of funny.
or you'll be put on a watch list.
Yeah. With the book, they were able to get away with a lot more because it was science fiction. And science fiction became a way to maybe critique the way things are going in the state without directly critiquing things.
Well, and I think there's a lot of kind of that same energy in this film. Well, we were just talking the other day. One thing that was kind of interesting is really, I think this is a movie that a lot of people in the West would have been able to like relate to, and something that was like critical of the Soviet Union. But because a lot of patriotic people didn't even want to touch anything from Russia because they, associated it with the Soviets, it took a very long time for it to get any respect in the West or get
Yeah.
people who were willing to watch it. Now, some of like the higher end like film lovers, and like several like very famous directors said that this was one of the most influential movies they ever watched. But I don't really think this is one that the masses ever got to see.
Yeah. Typically with films from more isolated countries with strict laws, typically movies that they make that are really good and not made just for their masses will end up at a film festival like Cannes and then never leave the film festival. Like it never spreads to everyone else. So it's actually great that this movie is being seen now by a much wider audience, and it's actually on YouTube by the company that owns it. So it's nice to have an official release.
It's an official release, and it's crisp looking.
Yeah, the only problem is there's one part, and it's during like the opening credits, but the little hit the like and subscribe graphic comes up.
Yeah, I laughed when I saw that.
And that also kind of reminds me, the credits. So something that was a little weird to me was this movie is in two parts. Now, do you know why it's in two parts?
I honestly have no idea why it's in two parts.
So they filmed all the outdoor stuff, and the lab that was supposed to develop the film, they did it wrong. And so pretty much all that footage was lost, and the Soviet like film board was gonna shut the film down because it's way over budget, and you can't just remake the film. Tarkovsky, he changed it so he would be making a two-part film. Now, if you're making a film in parts, you get a larger budget and more you get a longer deadline to make it. So by saying that the movie was a two-part film, he filmed the second part of all the outdoor stuff.
Oh, that's what I thought was strange, is the movie's in two parts, but it's not cut down the middle.
No, it's here's the first 30 minutes, and now we're in part two, and there's never another part.
No, the rest is part two. And granted, they could have split it into two parts if they wanted. How long was this movie again?
2 hours and 44 minutes.
Which, this is the part where you're just going to have to trust me on this. I know that we've described this movie as having a lot of walking and a lot of talking in it. It's actually felt really like it was a breeze to watch. We were surprised when we got to the end that we had been watching for so long.
At the very beginning, it takes a minute to get to the zone because you really want to get to the zone. It feels a little slow, but then it gets going, and we watched it together and we paused it about an hour and 30 minutes in, and we were both really surprised that we had been watching that long. We'd watched an entire movie, essentially, and we didn't even realize it.
It's one of those movies where there's not necessarily there's no explosions happening. Nobody is constantly running from one enemy. There's no fighting going on. It's very mysterious. And kind of like the movie we talked about before on the podcast, Cure, it's one of those things where I feel like if you're looking for a meaning, there's one there to find somewhere. I feel like there's something here to uncover, and it's just also it's like you want to know like what choices are they gonna make, and what is the nature of the zone.
And I feel like you can also pretty comfortably walk away with your own meaning and not maybe be too far off from whatever the meaning is.
Right. I was kind of thinking we said that there were only kind of two-ish supernatural scenes, but there really was a third too at the end.
Well, I forgot to mention the phone.
Oh, I guess that's like four. Here, you want to go take us through the phone?
Yeah, so they are in this building where the room is, and there's just an old phone there, and it starts ringing. This phone that should have no connection to the rest of Russia has a connection, and at first Ryder, just without even thinking, picks up the phone, tells whoever's on the other line, no, this is not whatever they were trying to get, and then hangs up on them. And then they're like, oh, the phone just worked.
Right. It's funny because yeah, he so casually picks it up, and then after that they're all staring at it like, wait a second, what has just happened here?
But yeah, we mentioned the part where they go to the room, or Ryder tries to go to the room, the part where they get split up, the bird, the phone, and then you said there's another?
Yes. So one piece of information we're given, and it's hard to say what the significance necessarily of it is, but we're told that stalkers, that weird stuff tends to happen with their children. And we see towards the end, the stalker has a young daughter, and we see at the end that she can move things with her mind.
The movie just sort of ends on that, and I don't have a
Well,
I
and
don't have a conclusion to draw from that, honestly.
right, and I feel like it's a significant scene, and the reason I say that, so one interesting choice they made is when the movie opens up, it's black and white.
Or yellow and white.
Yeah, it's kind of like, it's not like they used black and white film, but it's like it has this washed tone that's very like drab looking.
So you're about to go into how it's like the Wizard of Oz, because when they go to the zone, it's in color.
Right, but when they get out of the zone, the color once again leaves, except for the scenes where we're just focused on the girl.
Mm-hmm.
Those scenes are also in color.
For one, on the Wizard of Oz, it feels extra connected because the black and white in the Wizard of Oz is also kind of yellow.
Kind of,
That's just
what is
something
that,
that-
like a sepia tone?
Yeah, yeah. That's just something I thought when watching it, but I think it has to do with just the zone in general. One thing about the Stalker, when they first get to the zone, they're on this railway track, and Stalker has to. He tells him to wait there, and he goes and leaves, and then he goes and lays down in the grass, and he loves the zone, unlike how maybe people who are in a death trap maze would love the zone. But I think because his daughter is sort of a product of the zone or connected to it, that might be why it's in color with her.
Well, and I guess the zone is kind of similar to Oz in a second way, is that we don't see it very often in a very like obvious way, but I mean there's almost some magic in the zone.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, I think the zone kind of has, in some ways, can kind of represent like hope or meaning in some way. I'm not going to go in too deep or make a huge argument about it here. I've seen this once, but we see that the stalker kind of doesn't really care for his life outside of it. And even though he himself never uses the room because he sees his role as stalker as kind of preventing him from doing that, you can tell that the only real like joy in his life is getting back to the zone and leading people to it.
Mm-hmm.
Part of it is, I think the sepia tone just kind of shows just kind of the Soviet Union, maybe the way Andre saw it.
Or
It's very,
yeah, because that's the thing is when they are outside it, the zone looks like a rough place, but that's because I mean it's a maze death trap. Of course things are derelict, but when you're outside of the zone, it's like, oh, this looks like a war zone.
right. No, the zone is dangerous but beautiful, while everything outside of the zone is kind of very drab and lifeless.
And I mean, the Stalker even brings up the possibility of moving his family into the zone, which, briefly talking about the book and the video game, nobody likes the zone, okay? No one wants to live in the zone. The zone is especially the book. Like you hate the zone. Well, the video game takes entirely place in the zone, so you sort of love being there, but it's
Because you like
it's not.
shooting at things in the video game.
Yeah, you like shooting mutants. You don't want to move your wife and child into the zone. And you mentioned the child. Another interesting thing that was in the book, but they departed from in the movie, sort of. So in the movie, he calls his daughter Monkey, and it just seems like a cute pet name. And really, the majority of her dysfunction is she can't walk, and then you see at the end she can move glasses. In the book, she is like quite literally growing fur and slowly losing her humanity and cannot move glasses with her mind.
Well, and I think that's one of the chief differences, I think, between the adaptions, the other adaptation, like the video games, the book, and then the movie. Is in like the movie, I think the zone is much more ambiguous as to what
Yes.
it is and what, because I think maybe with the books and the movie, it's obvious that there's a crap ton of radiation. So that probably has to do with, what's going on. Whereas here it's like, I don't know, it seems to be much more than that. It seems to be
Yeah.
supernatural.
Yeah. So the movie takes a very supernatural approach to it. The book just pretty much straight out tells you it's aliens, and the zone is caused by what is known as the visit. So when aliens showed up, and the whole thing, the reason the book is called Roadside Picnic is because aliens showed up. All of the cool junk inside of the zone is just crap they left behind. It's like if you had a picnic and you littered. Now, in the video game, which sort of takes concepts from both the book and the movie, but also things from the Chernobyl disaster. So it's much more radiation based and material. Radiation isn't really a thing in either the book or the movie. There's a golden orb that grants wishes in the book, and in the video game there's a sort of a room that grants wishes, but it's the monolith. I'd almost say that the movie and the video game aren't adaptations of the book so much as they take place in the same world. I feel like you could just say that the stalkers in every adaptation are not the same, supposed to be the same. It's just what if there's a zone and people going in and out.
Yeah, it's like they take a central premise, but each goes in a very different direction with it.
Yeah. Another thing I'd like to talk about is a little bit of the filmmaking. Uh,
Especially that opening scene.
yes. So, man, I cannot imagine how much effort was put into this movie, especially since Tarkovsky loves long shots. He loves them to death. I think there's one shot that goes on for 4 minutes straight, and especially in the opening, they're driving through the city trying to. There's a train that goes in and out of the zone because there's an outpost just inside the zone, and it delivers, I think, diesel to them. So that's the only way, pretty much in and out, and they drive their little truck right behind the train into the zone. But there are all these coordinated shots where the train moves into frame and they're doing stuff, and they'd have to perfectly time all of their actions combined with having a full diesel locomotive move through the scene.
Right. It's also very like fun and kind of like tense scene because they're trying to dodge cops at the same time and like hide and not make noise and then like drive behind. But yeah, I have no idea how they would have coordinated that all to make it I don't know, so seamless looking.
I mean, I'd assume that everything was really choreographed, but we talked about it being a slower movie. There was a I didn't memorize the quote, but somebody suggested to Tarkovsky that it should have been a faster, more action packed film, and he said that no, the movie should be slower and duller, so that anybody who comes into the theater leaves because they didn't come into the right movie.
Yeah, I remember seeing something along those lines. Well, and from what I hear, this has a lot of Tarkovsky's hallmarks. He likes to deal with movies that have metaphysical themes. He likes slow burns, and he tends to like long shots. And there's a lot of beautiful nature shots in here too.
Mm-hmm.
It really is like very stunning looking.
Yeah. The music in the movie I like, but it's also barely in there.
It's very background. I remember noticing it at a few parts, but I mean, if you asked me about what the music was like in the movie, I could not tell you.
There's actually an interesting bit where they just got into the zone and there's a little rail cart they take to go deeper into the zone. And it's just the three of them riding on this rail cart, and you hear the sound of, it moving along the tracks, but as it goes on, the sound sort of changes into the music.
Yeah, I
And
noticed that.
the music I'd almost describe as twangy space noises.
A little bit. In that way, it kind of did remind me of an American movie, of like some of the sci-fi movies in the 70s I've seen that kind of take like the odd soundtracks or use like, I don't think they necessarily did this here, but like the synth-esque, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the music, again, is not a big part of the movie, but when it is in there, it really helps add to it. Another thing that is sort of sad but interesting is this movie most likely killed Andre, his wife, and the actor of Ryder.
Right. If I'm remembering this right. Now, there were a couple different theories as to what did Andre in. He died officially of some sort of cancer,
Lung cancer, I believe.
but there was a chemical plant, I want to say upstream from where they were filming The Zone.
Yeah, so they were at this derelict. um
Like a hydroelectric plant?
yeah, that was where they
Okay.
filmed a lot of the room stuff. But yeah, there chemicals in the water, among other things. So there's a part where you see like this white foam on the water, and yeah, that's like super poisonous. And all three of those people died of cancer, of the same kind of cancer.
Right. Now, I don't necessarily think this is true, but one thing that's interesting is there was a conspiracy theory for the longest time that it had actually been the KGB that had
Oh,
killed Andre. Well, it was funny because I think there was an actual KGB agent who admitted that there had been like an order on Andre. I don't think that's necessarily what killed him or anything. I think it was the treatment plant, but there were some people who were like very skeptical about the official information.
man, that's wild. I didn't even see that.
Oh, I did. I thought like I'm like, oh, I have to mention this.
No, that. Ooh, you're killing your one good director.
Right. Well, it's so weird too because I mean, you don't think of the Soviet Union for any cultural exports. Its biggest cultural export was being the villain in American movies. Rocky Four is the Soviets' like pop culture
I
contribution.
guess in film schools they talk a lot about early, like at the start of the Soviet Union, propaganda films,
Right.
because they did pioneer a lot of stuff. But then after that, you don't really think much about
And I'm not
cultural
exports.
exports. Yeah.
Well, and this isn't me being dismissive because obviously seeing this movie, I believe there are probably some things that came out, but like I said though, as far as the world abroad, the Soviets didn't really seem to have a lot of cultural influence outside of Eastern Europe. But now if you go and several lists, if you look at like the top 100 greatest films of all time, this one is almost always in there, as well as a couple of Tarkovsky movies that he made during his time in the Soviet Union.
I think he made 11 movies, maybe give or take. And all of them really highly rated for the most part. I think maybe the first One or two of the first movies maybe isn't super high, but all of them are considered classics for the most part.
And maybe not to the average person outside the Soviet Union, but if you were a famous director at the time, he seemed to be on your radar. He's been called one of the most influential filmmakers of all time, and I've seen several directors who are well known, even like Akira Kurosawa, had high praise for Tarkovsky.
Yeah, he's definitely somebody who I wish I had seen his stuff prior to now. Because
Right.
he was completely outside of my radar. I didn't even know. I played the video game. I didn't even know there was a book, let alone a movie.
When you told me that we were going to watch the Stalker movie, I had a very different idea of what this was going to be. And then at the end of the last podcast, you kind of blindsided me when I said, "Well, we're done with the highbrow stuff now." And you're like, well, actually, we're going to do Stalker. And I'm like, is Stalker like the video game? That's what you're calling highbrow, Mr. Bones?
The game where they say cheeky breeky and sing the silly Russian songs?
Yeah. So, yeah, I had no idea kind of what we were in for, and I'm not 100% sure what I just watched.
I'm really glad I watched it, though.
Yeah.
That's the thing is, like, I really want to watch it again. But that 2 hour and 44 minute price tag is just like, man, do I really have time to figure this movie out? Maybe someday.
Yeah, this is a movie I probably will watch again, but I'm going to let it sit for a while.
Real quickly, you might be wondering why it is even called Stalker. And I thought this was an interesting fact that I wouldn't have known unless I had listened to the audiobook. There was a little thing from the authors in there. But if I remember correctly, stalker is a word that does not exist in Russian, or there probably is a word for it, but stalker by itself is not a Russian word. But there's a character in a Rudyard Kipling book named Stalky, and Stalky is like clever. He's streetwise, essentially. So they just took that character's name, and that's why he's called Stalker, not because he is hiding in trash cans waiting for his girlfriend.
Well, I assumed it was stalker because he stalks as you might stalk a deer through, the zone or whatever. But that makes sense.
Yeah, I think the streetwise.
I don't think Stalky would have
yeah
caught on quite as well.
Much better than Stalky.
Stalky.
Or Zone Guide.
Right. Well, you want to transition here to cast and crew?
Yeah.
There's only four that I wrote down, really. Stalker, Ryder, Professor, and then we do have some pretty important scenes with Stalker's wife, so I included her on here.
Do you have her name written down?
Yes. I'm going to be pronouncing this Elisa.
No. That's not what I meant. I meant her character name.
Oh, no, I don't have her character name.
So her character name is Xenia Stalkera.
When do we hear that?
They don't. That's just what her credit is. And I was like, oh, they just gave her a name and then Stalker but feminine at the end.
Yeah, that's kind of dumb. I just have her written down as Stalker's wife, but she's played by Elisa Freenlich. And what's interesting about her is she was voted the People's Artist of the USSR in 1981. And then later, when she was like 70, Putin came personally to her to award her the state prize. This is probably one of her more notable ones. She was also in a film called Agony, which is, I'm pretty sure, about basically the end of the monarchy in Russia and Rasputin on the scene.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I thought that was kind of interesting. She was obviously a big deal in Russia.
Of the four actors, her and Professor, who was Nikolai Grinko, were the two most active actors because both Stalker and Ryder died in their 40s. So, and they were in a lot of stuff, but they weren't able to be in as much.
Nikolai Grinko is kind of interesting too, because he is a good actor, but for the longest time he had trouble getting any work because while watching the film, I doubt you could tell, but he was Ukrainian, and that kind of mattered. He wasn't considered native. So because he was a non-native actor, a lot of people didn't want to work with him. However, definitely Andre was an exception because he also appears in the movies Solaris and Ivan's Childhood, both of which are Tarkovsky movies.
Yeah, so writer, professor, and stalker are constantly dipping into each other's projects. All three of them were in a movie called The Bodyguard, and the composer of Stalker, Edward Artemayev, forgive me, I'm going to butcher some of these names
Hey, at least
probably.
Japan's getting a break from it for
Yeah,
once.
these names are actually much easier to pronounce, but his name is very difficult for me. But he composed the music to Solaris, Mirror, which are both Tarkovsky, and then he did the music for Bodyguard, which I thought was funny that he, despite being unrelated to the actors, was also did music for the movie that all three of them were
I
in.
guess they all liked working with each other. Or maybe they had to. I have no idea how filmmaking in the Soviet Union
Yeah,
worked.
part of me wonders if it was sort of a tiny pool. Crossover is very likely, but it could have just been how it was that through coincidence they all kept ending up in the same junk.
Well, and writer was another notable fellow. His name is Anatoly Solzhenitsyn, and he won an award actually for having the starring role in a movie called 26 Days from the Life of Dostoevsky. And I thought that was interesting for two reasons. One, obviously, because he wanted a major award from it and got a lot of recognition, but also because I don't know. I'm obviously not an expert on Russian literature or thought, but there definitely some. I think we mentioned before that there's definitely some like Dostoevsky slash philosophy in this movie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Anatoly was a longtime collaborator with Tarkovsky, so he is Andrei Rublev in the movie Andrei Rublev. Nikolai Grinko is also in Andrei Rublev. Anatoly constantly showed up in Tarkovsky's movies.
And finally, that brings us to the stalker himself, who's played by Alexander Kaidanovsky, is how I'm pronouncing that. And he was notable of them because not only was he an actor, but he also directed some features.
Yeah, he was a writer and a director. Had a really interesting life because he started out going to trade school to become a welder. Then he wanted to be an actor, and then he joined the cavalry. And then I think he came back to acting and writing and directing. And he was in an adaptation of 10 Little Indians. I mentioned The Bodyguard. He was also in a movie called At Home Among Strangers, A Stranger Among His Own, which was pretty highly rated. Beyond the Russian stuff, he showed up in a few Spanish films that gave him popularity outside of Russia. And he was invited to be a juror at the Cannes Film Festival. And then I think the year after he was invited to do that, he died because he was a severe alcoholic. I'm pretty sure it was alcoholism. I might be wrong there, but I think he died at 50.
Oh, which is a shame because, like I said, it's kind of sad that this movie, despite all the accolades it's gotten, I feel like to the average person, this is like nobody has ever even heard of this movie.
Yeah.
And if they have heard of it, that's because they like clicked the Wikipedia page on the video game and saw that it was based on something
Mm-hmm.
or loosely inspired, however you want to
They watched a
cut it.
video of giving them a lore breakdown of their video game, and
Right.
it just happened to offhandedly mention.
Well, and that's not me digging at anybody too. It doesn't matter how you get here as long as you get here, right?
Yeah.
But I think it's funny for the kind of movie it is and for how influential it was, how also relatively unknown it is.
And this is less with Grinko, because, I mean, he was in a lot of stuff and lived a pretty long life, but both Alexander and Anatoly, they are great actors. And actually, looking back, I think Anatoly, the writer, might be the best performance in the film. You don't really like him. I'd say he's probably the most complicated and the one given the most dialogue, I think. But his performances, like looking back, it's like, oh wow, I think he's maybe the best part of the movie. Maybe not the most likable part, because the stalker is obviously the most likable person in this movie.
And by that we mean the only likable person of the
Yeah,
three.
but I don't know. I really, the more I've thought about it, the more impressed I am with the Anatoly.
And honestly, I'd say the second best performance. This might surprise you saying that, but I think it might be Elisa who gives the second best performance.
Yeah, she's not in the movie that
But
much.
her big scene, especially at the end when she's talking to her husband, I don't know. It really kind of strikes an emotional chord there.
Yeah, it's interesting the end because Stalker is crazy depressed, and when he's in bed, back at his home outside of the zone, and they have a conversation, which is in stark contrast to the beginning of the movie where she is very angry with him going back into the zone, especially you're told that he had just gotten out of jail. So the fact that he's going back in, possibly risking more jail time, possibly risking death, at the end, she is very loving to him. And then after they have a little scene together, she pretty much monologues directly at the camera about her and the stalker. It literally feels like she's just talking to the audience. I don't. How did you feel? Like,
Oh, I don't know. I just assumed she was still talking to him, or she was kind of. Sometimes, if you talk to yourself, just kind of spilling the contents of her mind.
yeah. But
But I can kind of see where you're coming from looking
watching it,
back.
I'm like, is she looking directly at the camera, just telling me her relationship?
Wait a second, Bones. Not again. Are you telling me the TV's been talking to you again? Bones. We talked about this. The meds are good for you. You have to take them.
No, I don't want to. I want to talk to the man on the television set.
He has nothing good to tell you.
Well, she had something good to tell me. Despite not being in the movie that much, she's very good.
We're kind of semi-ranking them here, but they're all fantastic.
No,
I
they're
mean,
all great.
the Stalker himself, especially at like the end of the movie too, even during that scene where he's tried to take these people to the one thing I guess that gives his life meaning, and they've rejected it. I
Yeah.
mean, he gives like a really
Not
kind
only
of
rejected it,
heartbreaking,
but we're going to blow it up.
right. Remember, no is not the worst thing that can happen.
Correct. That scene is especially sad because he is like this. This is all he has, is which is also kind of sad, despite having a family. The zone and the room especially are this is his thing, and the professor who you don't believe fully. I mean, none of them probably fully understand the room. There's ambiguity, not just for the audience but for the characters, and they're just gonna blow it up. Screw you, Stalker.
Well, I tell you what, it's funny because none of them start out being particularly hateable, but by the end of the movie, I loathed both the writer and the professor. Like, just absolutely just hated them. Part of it is for, the way the Stalker ends up at the end.
I'm not sure if I loathed them so much as I thought it's like, man, they just didn't get it.
Well,
Now that just assumes that I got it. I didn't get it
well,
either, but
to support your point, though, the wife says that they're not to be reviled, but to be pitied.
mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I think that's the better way to take it. But my initial gut reaction was kind of to be angry at him.
Yeah. Something else that a little strange is you almost get the feeling that the zone is in some way conscious and trying to lead them to the room because we hear 100 times it's a maze, it's full of death traps, one wrong move and you'll die, yet it's not very forgiving. It is practically handing the room to them on a silver tray. The writer goes and walks off, and then the zone tells him to turn back instead of striking him down like it probably struck down 100 people before.
But it does it a second time, and that's what's interesting is because we know that the zone can and does kind of strike people down, but it seems to have a soft spot for the worst among them, the writer.
And then, yeah, because the writer again wanders off again, doesn't get struck down. When the professor departs the party, he is somehow warped back to where the group is. And then there's this part that's kind of tense where they're going through this tunnel
Yes.
called the meat grinder.
Right, we understand that it's by far like the most frightening and dangerous part of all of it, but the writer makes it through.
They draw matches. Whoever gets the longest gets to go. And I don't think the Stalker rigged it, but the writer certainly thinks the Stalker rigged it so that he would be the one to go through it. And instead of throwing a nut, the writer essentially becomes the nut and has to walk ahead
Right,
while
where
they.
they like very carefully from a distance kind of follow after.
Yeah, and you're just waiting for Ryder to just implode.
Well, and I this is just me spitballing here, but one thing I do remember is they talked about what kind of people have like the best chance of getting to the room or getting through the maze, and it wasn't that it was necessarily the best people, like whether not really whether they were good or whether they evil, but who's like the most hopeless. And I wonder if that has something to do with why the writer does make it all the way through despite screwing it up at the end,
Mm-hmm.
is that the more he talks, the more like just of an empty husk of a man that he seems.
Yeah, but there's also like the Stalker keeps talking them up, saying that like they must really be good people inside, or
They're not.
that the zone knows that they're good people, or something like that. Especially since they keep getting second chances. He's like, I totally. He either says that he misjudged their character or judged their character correctly. I'm trying to remember what she said. He either
I think he says that he was correct that you know,
he judged correctly that they were actually good people.
which I don't believe.
I won't say that they aren't good people. They're just they didn't get it. They just
Well, and
didn't
I
get
think
it.
you're right there. I think these people kind of represent kind of even attitudes at the time. They're cynical, they're materialistic, and when they have their chance at meeting or at meaning, they reject it.
They have their chance at being happy, and
They choose misery instead.
yeah. Now, I guess if you don't really know whether the room grants, what you say you wish or what you desire deep inside, and whether you don't know if maybe you're a good person or not, or what you actually desire, then I don't know. Maybe it's smart for them to not go into the room. I don't know.
Well, it was interesting though with the writer because we know that the Stalker had a teacher he calls Porcupine. And the idea is that the Stalkers aren't supposed to use the room, and that Porcupine did and became very wealthy, but then later killed himself. Everybody has their own theory in the movie, so when I say something, don't take it as in, oh, that's what the movie for sure meant. But
Hmm.
the writer suspects that it was because he thought he was going to make amends or pray for his, or go and ask back for his brother he lost, but instead he received money because in the end that's all he really wanted. And the writer is kind of would rather drink himself to death than know for sure that there's nothing more.
Yeah, well, sort of alluded to that, or maybe just blatantly said, I don't remember, but that Porcupine sacrificed his brother in the meat grinder to get to the room,
Right, yes, you're correct.
which, something similar happens in the book. Also, the fact that all stalkers pretty much have a nickname is also from the book, but it's a pretty minor detail. Something that's a big part in both the book and the video game is that there's all of these what are called artifacts, which are in the book, bizarre alien technology. In the video game, I don't properly remember what they are, but the reason people are going into the zone is to get these artifacts and sell them because they're worth a lot of money to everybody who wants to study them or use them for nefarious purposes, possibly. So there's no artifacts in this movie other than, I guess, the concept of the room.
Right, no, the reason for going in and kind of the nature of it all is completely
It's
different.
solely for the wish room.
It's kind of really interesting when the movie adaptation of a book is almost more heady than the book.
The book is not like it's not Pulp Fiction. It's not written for the lowest common denominator, but it also,
You mean me?
yeah, it's not written for you. But at the same time, I was surprised in that after having seen the movie and you've got all this philosophizing, there's only maybe a couple parts in the book that are really just dialogue discussing things. It's not without its philosophical merits or even its interesting ideas about speculating about aliens and how they would see us, like the idea that they came here and they didn't even take notice of us. They didn't even care. They just dropped their junk off and that's it. And then
Yeah,
they
it
left.
was just a roadside picnic.
It was just a roadside picnic to them. And the fact that we could mean so little to these people.
Well, and it reminds me of a scene from the very end of the book where the stalker looks at the junk and he said, "What is this? Some kind of roadside picnic?"
Yeah. Man, I would have lost my mind had that line been in any adaptions, any in the book, in the movie. That did not happen. That is not in there. I'm sorry to burst everyone's bubble.
But what you should know is at the end of Stalker, or at the beginning of Stalker, we see Stalker look into the camera and he says, "It's stalking time."
I think we're at the point where we have exhausted things to talk about.
Well, there's more to say, but I don't want to give everything away. I really feel like I've already... Look, I've seen this movie once, and I'm still kind of processing it. I'm a little out of my weight class here.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you really just need to watch it. I don't think we can really do it justice other than to tell you to watch it.
Well, here's what I'll leave with. I do recommend this film, but if you know that you're a person who has no attention span, well, one, you should work on that.
Yeah, you should.
That's
fix
no way to
that.
go through life. But this one might be very difficult for you.
Yeah.
And go in knowing that you're not about to watch some sort of sci-fi action adventure movie, right? But I think that even if you're the kind of person who doesn't, sip wine and go to film festivals, I think you could actually find something here to think about and enjoy.
This is like one of those books you had to read in high school, but you actually got something out of it instead of pain.
One thing I like about this movie is I think I complain about this all the time so that I sound like I'm much older than I am, about a lot of new movies just kind of being samey to me, like I'm just watching the same thing pumped out time and time again. But when I watch this, I'm like, I really have nothing to compare this to. Whether it be the ideas or the way it's filmed or just kind of the general setting and story, incredibly different from any other movie I think I've ever encountered.
The only thing that it reminded me of, and not in the style, but mostly just in the quality, is of like the Sergio Leone Dollar trilogy, like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Not that it's shot like those movies, but just the overall quality of the shooting in those movies.
Well, and both of them I think kind of have heavy atmospheres with like long quiet scenes, in the Sergio Leone they usually have Ennio Morricone
The music is
playing.
blasting.
But there's a lot of like very still scenes.
Yeah. The atmosphere, definitely. Well, Duke, I think we're done rambling. It's a recommend from the both of us. If you got 2 hours and 44 minutes and are willing to watch Philosophy, we recommend. What are we watching next week?
Well, I saw that you picked this thoughtful spiritual movie, and I have a movie that's very spiritual for me.
Oh,
It's a little something called Flash Gordon.
that's very doable. It requires
Flash.
very little thought.
We're going to get into the philosophy of Flash Gordon.
Well, we couldn't dive too deeply into the philosophy of Stalker, Flash Gordon, prepare yourself for a 2-hour deep dive.
Yeah, that's what we're going to...
Because we're qualified to talk about that.
Hey, look, if Stalker, if you maybe you appreciate its merit, but maybe it doesn't sound like it's for you. Well, we've got Hawkmen, blasters, spaceships, and football. Are you ready for some football? Yeah, I think this one will be up your alley.
Yeah. Now, I know we just moved past this, but apart from recommending the movie, definitely play Stalker, Shadow of Chernobyl. It's wonderful Slav jank, and if you can read Roadside Picnic.
Or have it read to you. It's also free on YouTube.
Yeah.
And if you enjoyed this or were able to make anything of these ramblings, please like and leave a comment. We have been interrupted 7 times at least during the making of this, to the point where none of us can hold a coherent thought without it being interrupted. And this is going to be a hard on bones to edit. So show him some love, and then go to our comment section and type in what your stalker nickname would be.
Yeah, you could do that, I guess. You could also find us on Spotify, Apple, Castbox.
And regardless of what you do, there's one thing you must do every night, and that's keep it cold.